We're rolling.
Hello, my name is Seán Curran. I am a choreographer and a dancer and an arts professor here at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts Department of Dance. And I'm really happy to be in conversation today with...
I'm Stephen Petronio, and I'm the artistic director of the Stephen Petronio Company. I've known Seán for like 100 million years. We came up in the 80s.
We did indeed.
And here we are, and so we're just about to open at Skirball NYU with a new show.
Well, you know, I want to talk about the 40 years you've maintained a dance company. And speaking of 100 years, I was in the audience at DTW for, I think it was called Walk-In.
Oh my God, yeah, in 1986.
In 86. So I've been there, I bought the t-shirt, I've been a big fan for a long time. But you know, I was lucky enough last week to be invited to a rehearsal. I got to see Act 2, the first day you were doing it with the new music.
That was a frightening moment.
Very exciting for me, frightening for you. But I said to you at the end, I don't know if you remember, it feels strangely familiar, but also really fresh. I also said, what do you want to talk about? And you said, I want to talk about this. So let's start with the title, Breath of the Beast.
Breath of the Beast. Okay, so I have, you know, this is coming out of the pandemic. I mean, it's a story we've all heard a million times, but getting locked down for a certain amount of time, and then the company went on to a sabbatical this December, so I really was not making for quite a long time, and so I was, you know, the company in that moment still had the Petronio Residency Center up in Round Top, and I was alone in the studio on a mountaintop. My dancers like away from me, trapped in their apartments, and then we went into a period of no working, and so the beast was on the mountain, and so the Breath of the Beast really is kind of a joke for that person that comes alive in the creative process. So the beast is sometimes a very friendly beast, and sometimes a menace, and so you know, I always feel that my creative life is animal and intuitive, and this person is a social, kind of a nice guy. I was raised well, and, at least I think. So yeah, the Breath of the Beast is the breath of the creative soul of myself and my dancers.
Well, you mentioned COVID, and you mentioned that some of the beasts are friendly. And when I asked you about your musician, Jennifer Coe, I was surprised to find out, when I said, how did you find her? It was during COVID. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so you know, like everybody, I was having a hard time. I didn't realize what a hard time I was having mentally, but my husband, Jean-Marc, was like, look, why don't you check out this recording of the Bach partitas that I've been listening to. It's really cheering me up. It might do the same for you. So I began listening to the Bach partitas in D minor by Jennifer Coe, and honestly, there was such a calming and inspiring relationship I developed with that music, and so I didn't know Jennifer Coe before that, and I was mentioning it to a colleague of mine, Stanford, and he said, "Oh, I know Jen. Would you like me to introduce you?" And I was like, "Yes." So we spoke, and it turned out that we didn't work on the partitas, but the proposal was, would you improvise live, build a live improvised score for me? So.
Yeah. And it's exquisite motor for dancing. I feel like it's like a motor. It's like a filmic kind of score that makes a dance. It feels like the dancers are dancing in the music in a way. The famous Jerome Robbins quote. You know, I don't want to give too much away, but I think it's so valuable because I know a lot of my students at Tisch listen to these. If you talked a little bit about your compositional strategies. Again, I don't want to give much away, but there are some gorgeous trios where the space is just braided. There's some wonderful sections where the dancers are facing upstage or away from us. Talk about the choreography, the making and the doing of this dance.
Sure. So the Breath of the Beast. So I had a long time to prepare this mentally, and I usually work on my dancers. I draw everything on their bodies, especially now I'm in my mid-60s. You know, I show them movement, but I draw it on their bodies, and that's how I learned to work really. But I had a lot of time to think about the mise en scene for this piece. So I came into the theater when I was invited, and I looked at the stage, and there's quite a long orchestra pit that's, when it's raised, is a playing space. So I had the idea to divide the piece in half, part one and part two. Part one is playing on the raised orchestra pit and not on the stage. And so part one is kind of a sketchbook, a process moment. There's no costumes for that section. There's a lot of things get left on the cutting room floor when you're making a dance, and some of those things are my favorite things.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of those things that didn't make it into the piece that are there. And I actually make movement on the dancers in process in front of the audience in part one. And then part two is the costumed, music dressed piece that you'll see. So originally I thought the whole first act was going to be with our back to the audience and the whole second act would be facing forward. But that idea of back and front kind of mixed in throughout the whole piece, so I'm glad you noticed that. And I find what you don't see can be just as interesting, and sometimes more than what you actually do see. But compositionally, the braiding that you were talking about, so I was actually working to so because it's a score that's improvised, I didn't hear anything until very recently. So I built it to some other music that I don't want to really discuss. But there was a kind of a jig thing that I was using for that braiding, and I don't read music. I'm not a classical musician. I'm not classically trained, but I have a good instinct for space. And that jig was just very circular, and so I made the ending section. And I wanted something that was kind of rousing for the last section, so that braiding is something that I really love to do. It's something that I used to do very early on in my career, kind of an obsessive pattern maker. I thought in the 80s that was a skill that I had to have, so I learned to make interweaving patterns. So that's how the piece ends. But I do, I use compositional techniques that run the gamut. People learn movement from me rote, step by step. Sometimes I'll show them something and they'll interpret it, and their mistake or their interpretation or their mistake is more interesting than what I did. I often use chance situations compositionally that we then capture and memorize. So anything is really fair game when I'm building a dance.
Yeah, I'm a composition teacher. I teach comp to 17-year-olds in their first year of college, and it's difficult to keep them engaged. They just want to dance, right?
I never took a comp class.
Good for you, but you worked with the best, so there's some osmosis.
Well, I started as an improviser. Yeah. I started as a contact improviser. So, and also I took an improvisation class in college, and one of my early assignments was to build a score for moving people based on something, and I used a photograph of Ben Sean. So, space and time and how bodies are composed in space is very important.
Yeah, and you're so connected to the visual art world. I remember a piece of the Joyce with a set by Anish Kapoor, and last time you were here, I think you worked with Robert Longo.
Correct.
Maybe talk a little bit about visual art, static, versus what you do in your painterly use of space.
Yeah, well, I started dancing in college, so I didn't really I didn't know anything about dance, but I did know something about two-dimensional art, and I was very inspired by the page. Because escaping my New Jersey roots was through books. So it was a flat page that then became, dimensional in my mind. That was my first escape hatch. And then I got into the Trisha Brown Company. I met Steve Paxton. I danced with him, and I got into the Trisha Brown Company. And then within weeks, I met Robert Rauschenberg and Donald Judd and these giants of the visual art world. And so I always saw dance next to visual art, and I particularly find when something's flat, it inspires me much more than something in 3 dimensions, although I work in 3 dimensions. So I see space in flat surfaces. For example, in Robert Rauschenberg, what I think is amazing about his work is its depth and movement. And many people try to copy the collage technique that he's used, but I look at his work and I never see the same thing twice because I see it moving and I see it in terms of dimension. So I find 2 dimensions extremely, and then film, of course. You know, a lot of my early techniques were I was copying filmic devices like close-ups. You know, I thought it was really clever when I was in my 20s to freeze a body and then have them just jam themselves up against the audience like a close-up or a jump cut, or you know, I used a technique for how to pan across the stage by moving the body in weird little steps, like a haystack moving across the space. So these were, you know, kind of filmic things that I was watching as a younger person and applying them to this dance form, which I really knew nothing about. I had no classical training and never took a ballet class. And I was just thrown into the improvisational world. So, you know, in many ways, it was a real plus for me.
So you've opened a door for me. I'm really glad that you opened. And to give a little context, I just stepped down from being the chair of the dance program at NYU. And one of the best jobs, one of the things I loved the most was I got to choose who would come and make a new dance for the students, or what dances could be set on the students. And my very first list had Set and Reset, original cast member, first Trisha Brown, and Middlesex Gorge, and I'm happy to say we got both. Can you talk a little bit about this journey from Set and Reset, Middlesex Gorge, so many other pieces, to Breath of the Beast? Like, you've had a company for 40 years.
Yeah.
You've been making dances for a long time. How's it changed, evolved?
Well, Middlesex Gorge, just to say, is a piece that I made in the late 80s during the AIDS crisis. And you know, my work is not narrative driven. It's because I worked with Trisha Brown, who was all about movement and structure, and Steve, who, you know, nobody ever talked about the meaning of anything. You know, I remember sitting around the table with Trisha and Donald Judd, and you know, Donald Judd, a great visual artist, and they were talking about the cut of the sleeve and the shade of the color blue that was going to be, but nobody would ever talk about what anything meant. When I came into the world, sex was really important to me, and of course nobody was talking about sex. That was just, you know, but I didn't want to make works about sex, and because I had the these structural movement invention underpinnings, my task was to make movement that was infused with the ideas that I was interested in, but not illustrating the ideas. So occasionally I'll illustrate for fun, but you know, when I'm working on a pop song, I like to play that line. I get a lot of shit for it, but I like to ride that line of illustrating the lyrics and then going deeper. But for me, it's about building original movement that smells like something, but you can't quite put your finger on.
Yeah.
So how did I get from Trisha to there? Kind of like that. I mean, I was in ACT UP and I was getting arrested a lot, and so Middlesex Gorge. One of the Ayatollahs had died during that period, and he was getting carried by a massive group of people. And then I got arrested, and I was being carried to a police van in the middle of a giant crowd of protesters. And I somehow realized that I could put groups carrying and throwing and manipulating the body against very formal movement. And so that's how Middlesex Gorge came to be. How did I get here? I don't know. I learned very early on that if you want to work with someone that inspires you, call them up. Try to find out how to get in touch with them and call them up. And so, you know, all my first collaborators were friends. And then, you know, I remember when I worked with Cindy Sherman, an amazing visual artist and photographer, who uses herself as the subject for all of her work. So I remember being somewhere on tour and being very hungover in Europe, and I walked into a gallery, and I knew Cindy's work, but there was a piece of hers that just blew me away, and so I wrote it down, and when I got back to New York, I got her number and I called her, and she picked up the phone.
Wow.
Which was kind of, I mean, it was the I guess the early 90s. She picked up the phone. There were no assistants between us, and I invited her to collaborate, and so we did 3 collaborations. But that doesn't always work out that way, you know. I mean, I have gotten let down badly, but you know, a lot of people say yes too. So.
Yeah. You want a result, you take an action.
Yeah.
Clearly, in the work I've seen over the years and at that great rehearsal I was at last week, the dancers are your collaborators too, in a way. And
Yes, absolutely.
we've talked a bit about process. There's a kind of a choreographic or compositional virtuosity. The dancers are so virtuosic, and for me, virtuosity is taking something very difficult to do and making it easy. And you know, all dancers have what I call physical genius, but in your very recognizable, unique, authentic, you know, brand of movement, there's odd coordinations. You're pitting one side of the body against the other. Again, this fluid kind of magical use of space. And your dancers are, you know, it's a word that's overused now, iconic, you know.
But they are, they're like heroes to me.
I went to a season of yours at La Mama, and of course some of those dancers were in the room, and I was a little starstruck. Liv England is one of our graduates, and Laela Rogers, who's your general manager.
And Gino Grenick came out of
Gino
NYU,
Grenick,
and he was with me for 17 years.
Who came and set Middlesex Gorge, 2 casts. Talk about your dancers.
Yeah, so you know, so I'm not classically trained, but I'm a great thief, and I'm very quick, and I think the dancers, I think it may be very frustrating for them because I work really quickly, and if I can get something out in one rehearsal, it's much more coherent than if I take 3 weeks. So I tend to work very fast. One of my interests is to take the incredible training and intelligence of the dancer and confuse it so that they become instinctive reactions in movement as opposed to put your leg here, put your arm here, because you know, that kind of conscious placement, it's good for some artists, it's just not good for me. I love it when I don't know where I love being disoriented, and I love disorienting them, because that to me is when their humanity and their beauty and their skill comes out. So so I look for dancers that won't kill me when I do that. And they have to, you know, I always say there's something wrong with all of us because we like this, you know, those are the kind of people that I'm drawn to. It's frustrating. I know when Liv came in, you know, Liv came in during the pandemic. I actually auditioned her on video. And so she came in, and then she didn't get to perform for a long time. But, you know, getting thrown into a room full of swift sharks was not easy, and she's done amazingly. So, and also, I know she felt she didn't know how to get into the process, but she showed absolute hunger for what she didn't know, and that's something that, you know, for example, in this show, I made this beautiful second act. I made the second act first. I think it's beautiful. It's extremely well crafted, and it's all written. You know, it's polished and shined and ready to go. And then I finished that, and then 2 weeks later, I began building Act 1, which is like a scrapbook, and nobody knew what they were going to do. And so I began throwing improvisational ideas at them that we might demonstrate in front of the dancers, and they all took it like, you know. And at the very last minute, I asked them to bring something back from the 90s that's quite balletic, and we're ending Act 1 with that. And I paired it with a hate list, a list of things that I hate. So, you know, they were learning that this week.
Yeah.
So they have to be, you know, as soon as we learn something and we get good at it, I want to go on to the next thing. And they have to be willing to do that, and this group is incredibly willing to do that.
So many years ago, I was teaching a workshop to New York City public school teachers at the New Vic, and sitting in the corner was a young man who was a work-study student, and I had everyone improvising, and I said, you probably do the same thing, get up and dance with us. And it was Jerron Herman.
Oh, that's funny.
And he was fearless, a dancer, now a professional dancer who has cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
But I called Heidi Latsky, one of my best friends, who has a company of abled and disabled dancers, and I said, you got to meet this guy. And Jerron went on to dance for her for many years, make his own work. He's a writer. Tell us about how you found Curran and how he fits into the evening.
So Curran is my guest artist, and so when I was thinking about this evening, I was thinking, the group is smaller than it's ever been. There's six. Well, we've had groups of 6 before, but it's been 14 and 15. We're down to 6 people for this show, and I wanted to have there was resources for a guest artist, and I was looking for one, and I was thinking, oh, do I want to go to ballet? Do I want to? And Curran, so the Petronio company, up until very recently, had a research and development facility up in Round Top, New York, in the Catskills, and it was there to we would give time and space to young artists. And Curran, first met him. He had one of those residencies. And then I have a program called Bloodlines Future. So Bloodlines, paying homage to the past, we were doing works of Trisha Brown and Yvonne Rainer and Steve Paxton. Bloodlines Future is the next generation after me, people who seem to have a relationship to that lineage that I am interested in. And so Curran first he got selected for a residency up at Crow's Nest by a panel, and then I saw him on that when I was on that panel, and then I saw another work of his, and I invited him to be a Bloodlines Future artist. And he came up to me during the pandemic. I was so over emotional during the pandemic, and halfway through it, we did a performance at Fall for Dance. In the middle of the there was a little chink in the pandemic, and when everything opened up, we performed the Robert Longo, Joseph Van Tighem collaboration there, and Curran was out on the street, and he put his arms around me, and that was the first time I felt him. And I'm going to start crying because he's such a beautiful, enlightened soul. And he said, look, I love you and I thank you. And that sounds like a big deal. I mean, like nothing, but to me it was a giant deal. And so he just really impressed me. And then, so when I was thinking about guest artist, I thought, can I ask Curran? And there was a whole lot of considerations. I had made works for differently abled dancers before, so I wasn't afraid to do it. But I didn't know if he was interested. First of all, I didn't know if he was interested. So I called him. He said absolutely, and we got into it. So he has a solo. He's a guest artist. He has a solo. He's in the first part, in the process part, and then he has a solo in the middle. It's kind of the heart of the act 2.
Yeah.
And he, working with him was a revelation. He is fearless.
Yeah, I'm moved too, and I like to say that's art doing its job.
Yes.
What you're feeling.
Yes.
It is the heart. I only saw the second act, but I had this sense that it made me sit up and lean forward before you resolved it. Yeah. And I'm not going to give away the ending or anything like that, but it is filmic. It is like zooming in. It is like the detail of the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
It's really well crafted, a word you've used, and very vivid. When before we started this, we said, how much time do you have? And you said, I just got to warm up a little bit later. Sounds like you're dancing.
Yes, I am dancing. So, okay, I'm 67, full disclosure. I haven't danced in a long time, and during the pandemic, my body really began to fall apart because I wasn't working really. And once I finished, so this act 2, part 2 of the work is made on improvisations that I made on my body up in lockdown, and I made them as a kind of a documentation of a 65-year-old man falling apart, and it was kind of a masochistic thing, and I was alone. I had nothing else to do, so I did it. And I looked at them and I was like, "That's disgusting. I can't believe that. That's me." And then I looked at them a few months later and I was like, "These are interesting." So. And I never ask the dancers to move like me. It starts with me, but I supercharge it because there are these amazing virtuosic athletes. And so the whole beginning of the piece is made from captured improvisations that I did in lockdown. So in the process of learning that stuff, I realized, you could do this. And so I'm being me on stage, and my body feels pretty good, so I figured seize the moment before that ship sails.
Well, I'm 62. I'm still trying to get out there. I say the Donald McKayle line. He used to say, "I'm still kicking, just not as high."
Yeah, exactly. Well, I stopped, well, you know, when there was a point when I stopped because I couldn't do what I used to do. And now that that is well behind me, the world has opened up again.
Yeah. Couple more questions.
Okay.
We're sitting in your dressing room at Scribble Hall, out in the theater. The crew is setting up, and your longtime lighting designer, Ken Tabachnik, is setting levels and working his magic. Talk a little bit about light in your piece, because it is an important element.
Well, it's it's a visual element, and I always say the curtain goes up, and the first thing you see is the costume, and the second thing you see is the light, and then you begin the movement unfolds. So those are really important elements. And I met Ken when I was a young dancer with Trisha Brown, and he was a young assistant to Beverly Emmons, who was lighting Trisha Brown, and we shared a fondness for Scotch. So we would hang out at the bar, and I began to tell him that I was choreographing, and he said, well, let me try lighting. And so Ken has lit almost everything I've done, maybe 2 or 3 pieces he had to be away for. But it's been 40 years and he's lit everything. He knows me. We're the exact same age, but he's kind of like the adult in the room. And he is very discerning. He could understand a structure before I tell him. And he's a smart guy. Look, Ken has been a lawyer. He's been a director of the Hampton Film Festival. He was the ED at the City Ballet. I mean, he's done a wide range of jobs, but he's lit a lot of dance, and he's very smart. And he could help the composition magnify with his light, and he does often.
Yeah.
So.
Last question. Breath of the Beast opens tomorrow night. What's the next piece? Is your favorite piece the next piece? What are you dreaming about?
I do get very bored if I'm not making something. So this piece started by listening to Jennifer Coe do the Bach partitas in D minor, and I thought that I was at this age. I've never done anything like that. It's always edgy compositions. I worked with Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson, and then I've worked with Michael Nyman. I always want it fresh. But I thought that at this point in my life, I could do the Bach, and it might be interesting. So that's what we started with that conversation. It didn't work out that we could do that. So I think the next one is going to be part 3, and it's going to be to the Bach partitas. So,
wow, I'm glad I asked.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Steve Petronio, we have to let you warm up and get ready for your big day tech and dress rehearsal. So grateful for this. I've been nourished for so many years by what you make and do. Now I'm getting emotional, and I cannot wait to be in the audience tomorrow night.
Well, I hope we don't disappoint you, and I hope you enjoy it.
You have never disappointed, never will, and the little taste I had at rehearsal was delicious.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Scribble Hall.
Ding, ding, ding.